Welcome to this recollection of one of the most unsettling cases registered in the history of the United States. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments from where you are viewing this and the exact time at which you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to which places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1843, the valleys and ridges of northern Alabama still held secrets untold by white settlers. The rugged landscape of the Cumberland Plateau, with its dense forests and steep ravines, had become both haven and prison for one man whose name would come to be whispered with equal measures of dread and awe. This is the account of Samuel Greene, a man who escaped bondage only to become something far more terrifying than his former masters could have imagined. The first documented mention of Samuel Greene appears in the records of the Johnson Plantation, located approximately 20 miles northeast of Huntsville in the Tennessee Valley District. William Johnson, a wealthy landowner who had migrated from Georgia to Alabama in the 1820s, owned more than 40 enslaved persons, including a young man described simply as Sam, age 22, field hand. According to plantation ledgers preserved in the Madison County Historical Society archives, Sam was noted as troublesome and had attempted escape twice before his 23rd birthday. The Johnson Plantation lay in the shadow of the southern ridges of the Cumberland Plateau, where the land rose sharply from the fertile valley. The mountains to the east stood like sentinels, their forested slopes offering both danger and possibility. For someone contemplating escape from bondage, these wilderness highlands represented perhaps the only viable route. North was Tennessee, with its own plantation system, west the treacherous Tennessee River, and south deeper into Alabama's plantation heartland. It was on the night of October 11th, 1843, during an unseasonably cold autumn storm, that Sam Greene disappeared from the Johnson Plantation for the third and final time. Unlike his previous attempts, this escape showed careful planning. The Overseer's Journal, now housed in the Alabama Department of Archives and History, noted that Greene had taken a wool blanket, a knife used for butchering hogs, and approximately 2 weeks of dried provisions from the smokehouse. What makes Greene's escape remarkable was not merely that he successfully fled, but that he chose not to continue northward toward the Free States, as most fugitives did. Instead, historical evidence suggests he moved deeper into the mountainous wilderness of northeastern Alabama, into the rugged terrain where few white settlers ventured. The first suggestion of Greene's transformation came 3 months after his disappearance, in January of 1844. A hunter named Elijah Thornton reported to the sheriff of Jackson County that he had encountered a Negro man, wild in appearance, while tracking deer near what is now called Guntersville Lake. According to Thornton's account, preserved in county records, the man was dressed in animal skins and carried a crude spear and knife. The encounter ended with the man vanishing into the underbrush before Thornton could approach or speak to him. Over the next several months, similar reports filtered in from trappers, hunters, and the few settlers brave enough to establish homesteads in the more remote valleys of the region. The figure was always described similarly: a tall black man with a distinctive scar across his left cheek, matching Samuel Greene's documented physical description, dressed in animal hides and demonstrating remarkable woodcraft. What began as curious sightings, however, soon took a more sinister turn. In April of 1844, a small hunting party led by Thomas Wilkes failed to return to their settlement near present-day Scottsboro. When a search party located their camp, they found it destroyed, with signs of violence and 3 of the 4 men missing. The lone survivor, James Carter, was discovered hiding in a hollow tree nearly a mile away in a state of extreme distress. Carter's account, recorded by the county magistrate, describes an attack by a Negro mountain devil who moved like a phantom through the trees and who killed his companions with terrible efficiency. While authorities initially dismissed Carter's story as the ravings of a man driven mad by some more mundane tragedy, subsequent events would lend credence to his claims. Throughout the summer and fall of 1844, isolated homesteads in the region began reporting thefts, not of valuables, but of practical items, tools, weapons, cooking implements, and clothing. More disturbing were the reports that these thefts occurred while the cabin's occupants slept, with the intruder somehow entering and exiting without waking them. By December of that year, the figure had acquired a name among the local populace, the Mountain Devil. Rumors spread through settlements that this was no ordinary fugitive, but a man possessed of supernatural abilities who could move silently through the night, survive the harshest conditions, and who harbored a particular hatred for white hunters and slave catchers. Newspaper accounts from the Huntsville Democrat, now preserved on microfilm in the state archives, dismissed these stories as superstitious fancy, though they acknowledge that some Negro fugitive appears to be living as a savage in the highlands to the northeast of our city. The Mountain Devil might have remained a regional curiosity had it not been for the events of February 18th, 1845. A slave-catching party led by Jeremiah Burke, a notorious figure who had made his reputation retrieving fugitives throughout the South, ventured into the mountains with the specific purpose of capturing the elusive figure. Burke had been hired by several plantation owners concerned that Green's continued freedom might inspire others to attempt escape. Burke's party consisted of 6 men and 4 tracking dogs. According to the sole survivor's account, they followed their dogs deep into a narrow valley on the 2nd day of their expedition. As darkness fell, they made camp near a stream. Shortly before midnight, the dogs began to growl and then fell silent. What followed was described as a carefully orchestrated slaughter. The survivor, a man named Michael Reynolds, reported that shadows moved among the trees, and the slave catchers were killed one by one, pulled into the darkness without a sound. Reynolds himself escaped only by falling into the creek and being swept downstream. He would later tell authorities that as he clung to a fallen log in the water, he saw a tall figure standing on the bank, observing him. "He could have killed me with the bow he carried," Reynolds stated, "but instead he watched me drift away, as if he wanted me to tell what happened." The authorities could no longer ignore the situation. The deaths of 5 white men, particularly men employed in the legally sanctioned recovery of property, demanded action. In March of 1845, Governor Benjamin Fitzpatrick authorized a militia expedition into the mountain region to capture or kill the fugitive now openly identified in official correspondence as Samuel Green. The expedition, comprising 40 armed men led by Captain William Holt, spent 3 weeks combing the mountains. Their journals describe a frustrating pursuit of a ghost, finding abandoned camps still warm from recent fires, discovering caches of stolen goods hidden in caves, and occasionally glimpsing a distant figure who would vanish before they could close in. On the 18th day of their search, the militia discovered something that would cement Green's reputation in the folklore of the region. Deep in a remote valley, they found what appeared to be Green's primary encampment, a sophisticated structure built partially into a cliff face, incorporating a natural cave but extended with wooden walls and a thatched roof. Inside, they discovered an arsenal of weapons, 3 rifles with ammunition, multiple knives of varying sizes, several spears, and a bow with arrows. More unsettling were the personal effects of at least 7 men who had gone missing in the region over the previous year. Most disturbing of all was a journal, apparently kept by Green himself. The journal, written on paper stolen from various sources and bound with animal hide, revealed a man of surprising literacy and profound hatred. Greene wrote of his life on the Johnson plantation, describing in detail the abuses he had suffered and witnessed. He wrote of his previous escape attempts and the punishments that followed, and he wrote of his transformation in the wilderness. "In these mountains I have become what they feared, no longer a slave, but a demon of their own making. What mercy did they show? So shall I show the same." The journal also revealed that Greene had not been alone in the wilderness. He had encountered and formed alliances with at least 2 other fugitives, though he never mentioned their names, referring to them only as brothers in bondage. Together, they had developed a system of survival in the harsh mountain environment, hunting, gathering, and stealing what they couldn't produce themselves. Captain Holt's militia spent another week searching for Greene and his companions, but found no trace of them. It appeared that upon discovering the militia's presence in the mountains, Greene had abandoned his camp and retreated deeper into the wilderness. The expedition returned to Huntsville with the journal and other evidence, but without their quarry. The Mountain Devil's activities seemed to diminish after the militia expedition. There were fewer reports of sightings or thefts through the remainder of 1845, leading some to speculate that Greene had finally fled northward or perhaps died in the wilderness. This period of relative quiet ended dramatically in January of 1846. On the night of January 7th, William Johnson, Greene's former master, was found dead in his study. The circumstances were bizarre. The house had been locked from within, no items were stolen, and Johnson's body bore a single wound, a handcrafted arrow driven through his heart. On the desk before him lay a folded piece of paper with a message written in a careful hand. "Justice comes even to the mighty. Remember Samuel Greene." The murder of a prominent plantation owner in his own home sent shockwaves through the region. A second expedition was organized, larger than the first, with over 60 armed men and several professional trackers from as far away as Tennessee. This time, they were instructed not to take the fugitive alive. The expedition departed on January 20th, 1846, confident that with their numbers and the winter conditions exposing more of the landscape, they would succeed where the first had failed. They would return 2 weeks later with their numbers reduced by 17. Survivors described a campaign of systematic terror conducted by Greene and his allies. Using their intimate knowledge of the terrain, the fugitives separated groups of militia, led them into ambushes, created false trails, and struck at night when visibility was poorest. One particularly harrowing account tells of 6 militiamen making camp in what they thought was a secure position, only to awaken to find 2 of their companions missing and a message carved into a tree. "You hunt a man who learned to hunt from watching you." The expedition's leader, Major Thomas Bradford, ordered a retreat after losing more than a quarter of his force without even confirming a sighting of Greene. In his report to Governor Fitzpatrick, he wrote, "We face not a man, but a phantom who has mastered these mountains completely. He strikes and vanishes. My men fear entering the deep valleys or thick forests, believing death awaits in every shadow. I cannot, in good conscience, continue to risk their lives in what appears to be a futile pursuit." For the next year and a half, the legend of the Mountain Devil grew. While direct attacks became less frequent, Greene's presence remained a constant shadow over the region. Travelers reported finding crude warnings carved into trees along mountain paths. Slave catchers refused assignments that would take them into the highlands. Local Native Americans of the Cherokee tribe, who maintained a small presence in the region despite the forced removals of the 1830s, spoke of a vengeance spirit who protected those fleeing bondage. Perhaps most significantly, the number of successful escapes from plantations in northern Alabama increased dramatically during this period. While no direct evidence links Green to these escapes, oral histories collected from descendants of formerly enslaved people in the region suggest that Green and his companions operated a rudimentary network, guiding fugitives through the mountains and helping them evade capture. The last confirmed sighting of Samuel Green came in August of 1847. A surveying party working near what is now the Alabama-Georgia border encountered a man matching Green's description. According to their account, he approached them openly, carrying no weapons. The party's leader, Edward Mitchell, later wrote that the man identified himself as Samuel Green and spoke calmly with them for nearly an hour. Mitchell described Green as weathered but not weakened by his years in the wilderness. He noted that Green's speech was articulate and that he spoke with the confidence of a free man, not the caution of a fugitive. Most remarkably, Green reportedly told the surveyors that he was preparing to leave Alabama. "I have made these mountains remember me," Mitchell quoted him as saying. "Now I go to find what freedom truly means." Whether Green actually escaped northward, as his words to Mitchell suggested, remains unknown. No further confirmed sightings or incidents attributed to him appear in historical records after 1847. However, his legend persisted. Throughout the 1850s, plantation owners in northern Alabama continued to report that their enslaved workers whispered stories of the mountain devil who lived free in the wilderness and punished those who abused their power. During the Civil War, when Union forces occupied portions of northern Alabama, several officers recorded in their journals hearing tales from local residents about the Black Phantom of the Mountains, who had terrorized the region years earlier. One Union captain, James Woodson, wrote in 1864 that he had encountered an elderly Cherokee man who claimed to have sheltered Green in the last days before he left the region. According to this account, Green had indeed traveled north, eventually reaching Canada. The historical record provides no definitive conclusion to Samuel Green's story. Like many figures who exist at the intersection of documented history and folklore, the line between fact and legend has blurred over time. What remains clear, however, is that for nearly 4 years, an escaped enslaved man not only survived in one of the most challenging wilderness environments of the American South, but transformed himself from hunted to hunter, from property to phantom, from object to legend. The mountains of northern Alabama still stand, their valleys and ridges now crossed by highways and dotted with towns. Few who travel through this scenic landscape today know the story of the man who once made these heights his fortress and hunting ground. Yet in the small communities that have existed here for generations, particularly among the descendants of enslaved people, the memory of Samuel Green, the slave who escaped and became the most feared mountain man in the South, lives on. A complex symbol of resistance, survival, and the terrible price of freedom in a land built on bondage. The final entry in Samuel Green's recovered journal perhaps best encapsulates his transformation and legacy. "They made me property, but these mountains made me a man. They made me invisible, but here I learned to see in darkness. They tried to break my spirit, but instead forged something they could never control. I am what they created, turned back upon its creators. Let history remember this truth." And history, however imperfectly, has. In historical accounts collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s, several elderly, formerly enslaved individuals from northern Alabama spoke of Samuel Green, though they knew him by various names: the Shadow Man, Mountain Samuel, or simply the Free One. These oral histories suggest that Green's influence extended far beyond the terror he instilled in white authorities. To many enslaved people in the region, he represented a different kind of possibility, not merely escape, but defiance and even retribution. Martha Johnson, interviewed in 1937 at the age of 91, recalled stories her mother had told about Green. Mama used to whisper to us children that if the master was cruel, the mountain man would know, and he'd come down from his hiding place to set things right. We weren't supposed to talk about him, but everyone knew. When masters or overseers were found dead or disappeared, the slaves would look at each other knowingly. Nobody mourned those men. The psychological impact of Greene's existence, or even just the belief in his existence, on the institution of slavery in northern Alabama cannot be overstated. Plantation records from 1844 through 1848 show an unusual degree of restraint in the punishment of enslaved people in areas near the mountains. One plantation owner wrote to his brother in Georgia, "We must tread carefully with discipline, for there is a devil in these hills who has appointed himself judge and executioner of those he deems too harsh." This fear extended to the slave patrols as well. Thomas Weatherby, who served on such a patrol in Jackson County, wrote in his memoir, published posthumously in 1879, "No man wished to ride too near the highlands after dark. We had heard what happened to Burke's party. Some claimed it was Indians, or even a panther, but we knew better. There was a man in those mountains who had declared war on anyone who hunted his kind, and he fought that war with terrible efficiency." The winter of 1847 brought particularly harsh conditions to the mountains of northern Alabama. Temperatures dropped well below freezing for weeks at a time, and snow accumulated in the higher elevations. For someone living in the wilderness, even someone as skilled as Greene had become, survival would have been extraordinarily challenging. It was during this winter that some believed Greene finally departed the region. A fascinating document discovered in the 1890s and now preserved in the collection of the Alabama Department of Archives and History suggests one possible fate for Samuel Greene. The document is a letter dated May 1848, written by a Quaker abolitionist in Pennsylvania to a colleague in Ohio. In it, the writer mentions a remarkable man recently arrived from the southern wilderness, who identified himself as Samuel and claimed to have lived as a wild man in the mountains of Alabama after escaping slavery. The letter describes this man as bearing the physical and mental scars of both bondage and his years of solitary survival, but also as possessing an intelligence and dignity that commands respect from all who meet him. According to the writer, Samuel planned to continue to Canada, fearing that even in a free state, the recently passed Fugitive Slave Act might result in his capture and return to the South. If this letter indeed refers to Samuel Greene, it provides a rare glimpse of his life after Alabama. The writer noted that Samuel spoke of having extracted a measure of justice during his time in the wilderness, but now sought a quieter freedom among people who might understand his humanity. The letter concludes with the observation that Samuel carries with him a small journal bound in leather in which he writes with surprising eloquence. No further documentary evidence of Greene's life has been discovered. If he did reach Canada, he likely changed his name and perhaps created a new identity, as did many fugitives from slavery. The trail of historical breadcrumbs ends here, leaving us to wonder about the remainder of his life. However, the impact of Samuel Greene's 4 years as the Mountain Devil continued to reverberate through the region he left behind. Throughout the 1850s, as sectional tensions increased and the nation moved towards civil war, the mountainous areas of northern Alabama maintained their reputation as dangerous territory for slave catchers and patrollers. Whether this was due to Greene's ongoing influence, other fugitives who may have followed his example, or simply the power of his legend, the practical effect was the creation of a region where the enforcement of slavery became notably more difficult. Perhaps more significantly, Greene's story became part of a hidden oral tradition among enslaved communities. Passed in whispers from plantation to plantation, the tale of the man who not only escaped, but turned the tables on his pursuers served as both warning and inspiration. Unlike other well-known fugitives such as Frederick Douglass, who escaped to become a public abolitionist speaker and writer, Greene represented a different kind of resistance, silent, violent, and uncompromising. During the Civil War, when Union forces began to occupy portions of northern Alabama in 1862, some commanders reported an unusual phenomenon. Enslaved people fleeing plantations would often head not toward Union lines, but toward the mountains. Colonel James Montgomery, commanding a regiment that included formerly enslaved soldiers, wrote in his official report, "The local Negroes hold a curious belief that safety lies not with us, but in the high country to the east, where they claim some champion of their race once made his kingdom." This perception was so prevalent that Union officers began sending guides into the mountains to direct these fugitives toward their lines instead. One such guide, Sergeant William Jackson, formerly enslaved himself, reported conversations with those he encountered. "They speak of a man named Greene," he wrote, "as if he were still there, watching over those mountains. I try to tell them he's long gone, if he ever existed at all, but the belief runs deep." As the war progressed and slavery's hold on the South weakened, the legend of Samuel Greene evolved. In the uncertain and often violent period of Reconstruction, stories of the Mountain Devil took on new dimensions. For the newly freed black population of northern Alabama, Greene became a symbol of resistance and self-determination. For many whites, especially those who had lost power and privilege with the Confederacy's defeat, he represented their worst fears of black retribution. An account from 1871, recorded by a Freedmen's Bureau agent working in Huntsville, describes how the mere invocation of Greene's name could affect a situation. A dispute between a white landowner and his black tenants grew heated, with the former making threats of violence. An elderly black man simply said, "These mountains still have eyes, just as they did in Greene's time." The landowner reportedly paled and withdrew his threats immediately. Historian Claudia Mitchell Therrell, who has studied the folklore of the region extensively, notes that by the late 19th century, the Samuel Greene story had developed distinct variations depending on who was telling it. In white communities, she writes, Greene was portrayed as almost supernatural, a malevolent spirit who attacked without provocation. In black communities, he was a justice bringer, someone who punished only those who deserved punishment and who helped others escape bondage. These divergent narratives reflect the complex legacy of a man who, whether by choice or necessity, employed violence as a tool against oppression. The historical Samuel Greene, insofar as he can be separated from the legend, was neither demon nor saint, but a man formed by the brutal institution he escaped and the harsh wilderness that became his refuge. His actions, while certainly retributive, were not indiscriminate. No records exist of Greene attacking women or children, and even some white men, like the surveyor Edward Mitchell, reported peaceful encounters with him. Archaeological investigations in the 1990s brought a new dimension to the Greene story. A team from the University of Alabama, investigating prehistoric Native American sites in the Cumberland Plateau region, discovered the remains of a small cabin built into a protected rock overhang. Carbon dating of charcoal from the fire pit suggested occupation in the mid-19th century, and artifacts recovered included handmade tools, modified weapons, and most intriguingly, a metal button matching those used on clothing at the Johnson plantation during the 1840s. While it cannot be proven conclusively that this was one of Greene's hideouts, the location and timing align with historical accounts. Dr. Margaret Wilkinson, who led the excavation, noted in her report that the ingenuity displayed in this dwelling's construction speaks to someone with remarkable adaptability and knowledge of wilderness survival techniques. The site also commanded a view of one of the few trails leading into that section of the mountains, suggesting its occupant was concerned with detecting approach. By the early 20th century, the story of Samuel Green had begun to fade from public memory, preserved primarily in family histories and local lore. The rapid industrialization of parts of northern Alabama, particularly around Birmingham, brought new populations to the region with no connection to its antebellum past. The mountains that had once been Green's domain were increasingly crisscrossed by mining operations, logging trails, and eventually paved roads. Yet in some communities, particularly those established by formerly enslaved people and their descendants, Green's memory persisted. Church records from a small African Methodist Episcopal congregation near Scottsboro contain references to annual gatherings held on the anniversary of William Johnson's death, January 7th, described simply as Remembrance Day. According to elderly members interviewed in the 1970s, these gatherings commemorated the day justice came to the wicked master, a clear reference to Green's most dramatic act of retribution. Throughout the 20th century, as the civil rights movement brought renewed attention to America's history of racial oppression and resistance, scholars began to re-examine stories like Green's that had been largely excluded from official histories. The sparse documentary evidence made definitive conclusions difficult, but the consistency of oral traditions across multiple communities lent credibility to the core narrative. An escaped enslaved man had indeed lived in these mountains and become a figure of both terror and hope. Dr. Benjamin Turner, a historian at Howard University who has studied the Underground Railroad extensively, places Green in a category he calls wilderness maroons. Fugitives who, rather than attempting to reach the northern states, created hidden societies within the South itself. While Green appears to have operated primarily alone, or with very few companions, Turner writes, his strategy parallels that of larger maroon communities in the Great Dismal Swamp of Virginia and North Carolina, or in the bayous of Louisiana. These were people who didn't just escape slavery. They created alternative spaces of black freedom deep within slave territory. In the neighboring state of Tennessee, a curious echo of the Green story emerged in 1969, when an elderly woman named Sarah Jenkins granted an interview to a graduate student researching her family history. Jenkins, then 97 years old, claimed that her grandfather had been a companion to the Mountain Man of Alabama. According to Jenkins, her grandfather William had escaped from a plantation in Georgia around 1845 and made his way westward, eventually encountering Green in the highlands. Grandpa William said this man, Samuel, taught him how to live in the wild, Jenkins recalled. How to move without being seen, how to find food, how to make weapons from what the forest provided. They lived together for almost 2 years before Samuel decided to go north. Grandpa chose to stay in the mountains until after the war, then came down and found my grandmother. Jenkins's account, if accurate, provides a rare glimpse into the community aspect of Green's wilderness existence. It suggests that, contrary to his portrayal as a solitary phantom, Green may have served as a mentor to other fugitives, passing on the survival skills he had mastered. This aligns with the references in Green's journal to brothers in bondage and supports the theory that he played a role in facilitating other escapes. The full truth of Samuel Green's life and fate may never be known with certainty. Like many who lived under slavery, his existence was sparsely documented until his actions forced their way into the historical record. Even then, many of the accounts come from those who feared or hunted him, rather than from his own voice. The journal recovered from his abandoned camp remains the closest thing to a first-person narrative, but even that tells only part of his story. What is clear, however, is that for a brief but significant period, Samuel Green achieved something remarkable. He inverted the power dynamics of his time and place. In a society built on the absolute control of black bodies by white authority, He created a space where that authority could not reach, where in fact those who attempted to assert it did so at their peril. The mountains became his domain, a kingdom of one where he was not property but sovereign. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, interest in Green's story experienced a resurgence. A regional museum in Scottsboro established a small exhibit dedicated to the legend of the Mountain Devil, displaying artifacts from the era and maps of his suspected territory. In 2009, a historical marker was erected near the presumed site of one of his encampments, though the text carefully frames the story as local legend rather than confirmed history. More significantly, descendants of enslaved people from the plantations of northern Alabama have begun collecting and preserving family stories related to Green. In 2017, a reunion of families with roots in the region included a session dedicated to these oral histories. James Washington, one of the organizers, explained, "Samuel Green is part of our heritage of resistance. Whether every story about him is literally true doesn't matter as much as what he represents. The refusal to accept bondage, the determination to be free, and the courage to fight back when necessary. The mountains themselves have changed since Green's time. Where once stood unbroken forest, now stand towns, vacation homes, and state parks. Trails that were once known only to wildlife and the occasional intrepid hunter are now marked on maps and traveled by thousands of hikers annually. Yet in certain remote valleys, particularly in the deepest parts of the Cumberland Plateau, it remains possible to sense something of what Green must have experienced: the isolation, the challenge, and perhaps also the freedom. Park Ranger Deborah Coleman, who has worked in the region for over 2 decades, notes that she occasionally encounters visitors who come specifically because of the Green legend. They want to walk where he walked, she says. Some come out of historical interest, others because they see him as a hero. A few even claim to feel his presence still in these mountains. Coleman herself is skeptical of supernatural claims, but acknowledges the power of the story. When you're deep in these valleys, especially as darkness falls, it's not hard to imagine how a man who knew this terrain could move like a ghost, appearing and disappearing at will. Even today, with all our technology and marked trails, people get lost up here. In Green's time, these mountains would have been the perfect fortress for someone determined to remain free. In recent years, Samuel Green's story has attracted attention from scholars of what is sometimes called black survivalism, the strategies and skills developed by African Americans to ensure their survival in hostile environments. Monica Richardson, whose research focuses on this area, sees Green as an important case study. He didn't just survive, he mastered his environment so completely that he transformed from hunted to hunter, she observes. In doing so, he demonstrated a level of adaptability and resourcefulness that defies the dehumanizing stereotypes used to justify slavery. The psychological dimension of Green's impact has also drawn scholarly interest. Dr. Terence Watson, a historian of slave resistance, argues that Green's greatest achievement may have been the climate of fear he created among those who enforced the slave system. By striking at slave catchers and particularly abusive masters, Watson writes, Green attacked the foundational premise of slavery, that white authority was absolute and uncontestable. Every patrol that hesitated to enter the mountains, every overseer who moderated his treatment of the enslaved for fear of retribution, represented a crack in the edifice of control. For modern residents of northern Alabama, attitudes toward the Green legend tend to divide along predictable lines. Many white residents regard it as a colorful but exaggerated piece of local history, while many black residents view it as an important chapter in the longer story of resistance to oppression. Some local businesses have attempted to capitalize on the legend, with one outdoor outfitter offering Mountain Devil hiking tours of areas where Green supposedly lived, an irony that would likely not be lost on Green himself. As with many historical figures who existed at the margins of documented history, the absence of definitive records has allowed Samuel Green to become whatever various constituencies need him to be: demon or hero, murderer or freedom fighter, cautionary tale or inspiration. Perhaps the closest to the truth lies in the words attributed to Green himself in his final meeting with Surveyor Edward Mitchell. "I have become what necessity demanded. Judge me not unless you have worn the chains I broke." The most profound legacy of Samuel Green may be the questions his story forces us to confront about the nature of resistance to systematic oppression. In a society where legal recourse was non-existent for the enslaved, where every institution reinforced their subjugation, what forms of resistance were possible? What forms were justifiable? Green chose a path of direct, often violent opposition, a choice that few enslaved people made, but one that emerges from the particular circumstances of his life and the opportunities presented by the mountainous landscape where he found refuge. Throughout American history, the prevailing narratives of resistance to slavery have tended to focus on those who escaped northward and worked within legal and moral frameworks recognizable to white society. Figures like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, or Sojourner Truth. These individuals and their approaches to resistance are rightfully celebrated. But Samuel Green represents another tradition, one less comfortable for mainstream historical memory, the tradition of the maroon, the rebel, the one who refused not just bondage, but also the terms of engagement set by the oppressor. It is perhaps fitting that Green's ultimate fate remains uncertain. Some accounts suggest he reached Canada and lived out his days in quiet freedom. Others claim he died in the mountains during that harsh winter of 1847. Still others insist he never truly left, that he remained in his wilderness domain, growing old in the valleys and ridges he had come to know so intimately. This ambiguity allows his story to resist closure, to remain open-ended, much like the broader American reckoning with the legacy of slavery itself. In the end, Samuel Green, the slave who escaped and became the most feared mountain man in the South, emerges as neither myth nor fully documented history, but something in between, a figure whose existence is verified by enough primary sources to be undeniable, but whose exploits and ultimate fate remain sufficiently unclear to fuel ongoing fascination. His story serves as a reminder that the history of American slavery and resistance contains many chapters still partially obscured, many voices still not fully heard, and many acts of defiance still not widely acknowledged. The mountains of northern Alabama stand as they have for millennia, silent witnesses to countless human dramas played out in their forests and valleys. Among these, the saga of Samuel Green occupies a unique place, a testament to one man's extraordinary will to be free, and his transformation of a harsh wilderness into a weapon against those who had claimed ownership of his body and labor. Visitors to these highlands today, gazing out over the seemingly endless ridges fading into the distance, might well wonder, what other stories do these mountains hold? What other acts of courage, desperation, or defiance remain known only to the ancient trees and ageless stones? And what would Samuel Green make of the world his brief but remarkable rebellion helped, in some small way, to create? In the words of the final passage, attributed to Green's journal, "I came to these mountains a fugitive, running from what I was told I must be. I leave them a man, certain of who I truly am. Whatever awaits me beyond these ridges, I carry this truth within me, as immovable as the mountains themselves. I was born a slave, but I will die free, in body and in spirit. Let those who come after know it can be done."